Hey, it's Jordan with Studio GBK, and today I take a piece of redwood, chop it up, burn it, and turn it into a lava chessboard. Everything went great until I destroyed the clear coat and had to scrape a bunch of it out, but I didn't give up. So I bought this piece of redwood for only $24 and took it back to my shop to cut it up. And I've had people telling me to make a chessboard for a while now, and I've also said I'm going to make one, so it felt good to finally attempt this new project. I also love the game of chess. I play it all the time, and volcanoes are one of the most fascinating parts of nature, so that's what inspired this. I clamped a piece of that wood to my chop saw so that each square will be the same height. And I cut 32 squares because the other 32 are going to be filled with resin. If you can't tell by the way that I stacked those, I'm actually the Jenga champion of my family. I sanded them around the edges to remove those splinters, and after that, I burned all of them with my torch. Now, my goal here was to burn them, but still keep that beautiful redwood grain visible. So I didn't completely burn them, I just did a light char. And at this point, I'm ready to arrange them and build the mold. I used a piece of 1/8 inch particle board that I had laying around and applied tuck tape to the area where I'm going to pour. This acts as a barrier between the wood and the epoxy and doesn't allow them to bind together. I know some people use mold release spray, but I've seen enough disasters with that method that I just don't trust it. I'm not an expert, but I always use tuck tape just to be safe. I made sure that corner was perfectly square, and from there I placed these burned squares exactly where I want them and used hot glue to secure them in place. And I just started off with one square in the corner and used the other squares to gauge the spacing between them and make sure that the epoxy squares will basically be the exact same size as the wood ones that are around them. And it's super important that I don't mess this up or the board will not look right and square how I need it to be. After gluing these wooden squares into place, I mixed up some art resin and sealed all of them. And this is to trap the moisture and air that's inside and stop bubbles from coming into my finish when I pour. And I'm just going to tell you guys right now that I did not use enough of it. And this caused me a bunch of bubble trouble later. The end grain of the wood really soaks up a lot of epoxy, so I should have used a lot more, but not the end of the world. And at this point, I'm ready to finish making this mold. So I pulled out my tape measure for the first time during this project. And believe it or not, this thing was actually super square, just like a lot of you who are watching this right now. But jokes aside, it measured 10 inches and 15/16 by 10 inches and 15/16, which is such an irritating number because why couldn't it just be a perfect 11 by 11? But at least it did come out square. After that, I also measured and cut some 1-inch strips for the sides of this mold. And before you ask why I didn't use a table saw for this, it's because my table saw is broken and I need to buy a new one. So my skill saw skills are really coming in handy right now. I hit it with my air compressor to eliminate the dust and started gluing this thing together with hot glue. And this was my first time making a mold with only glue. I usually use screws and lots of caulking, but this mold is so thin it's basically impossible to screw it. So I glued this together and ran out of hot glue, of course. So I switched to CA glue to finish this mold without having to stop and run to the store. And I love how CA glue hardens within seconds of spraying that activator, but it smells very toxic. So I put gloves on and a mask as I did this. And somehow this thing did leak a little bit later, but I don't really see what I did wrong as I watched the video of myself doing it. And now I'm ready to pour my first layer of resin. This is a 2-part mixture with half resin and half hardener. So I measured and marked 2-inch lines on these homemade measuring cups that I created and mixed the two together. I mixed them really well for probably about 2 minutes. I've seen people using scales to measure epoxy, but I really don't think it's that serious. As long as you mix it well, you're usually fine. And the reason why I'm pouring a clear layer first is because I'll be adding LED lighting later, and I don't want to block that light from shining through the lava colored surface. So after giving that clear layer 24 hours to dry, I was ready for the bright volcanic layer, which is obviously the more exciting layer. I mixed up that same art resin, and the colors I'll be using are Naphthol Red Light and Pyrrole Orange. I recently made a volcano table and used these same colors, but it turned out more red than I wanted. So on this one, I made sure to allow that Pyrrole Orange to dominate because I really wanted this to look like fire and lava. As you can see, I poured that into each individual square and did my best not to make a mess of it. I also added some yellow pigment to each square and used a piece of popsicle stick to mix it around and make this fiery design that I'm going for. The problem here was that the yellow kept sinking down and disappearing on me, and it was actually making a crazy design on the bottom side that I wasn't even aware of because I couldn't see it. But I kept adding more and more of that yellow pigment, and it just continued to disappear from the surface. And I have a limited amount of time to make these designs because this is obviously going to dry soon. But after messing with that for close to an hour, I was pretty pleased with how it came out, even though it didn't have as much yellow as I wanted. So I torched out all of the bubbles and wiped off the resin that spilled up onto the surface of those wooden squares, and then left that there to dry. And when I came back the next day, it dried nicely and also kept those fire designs that I wanted. The only problem is that the resin is still an eighth to 3/16 low. So I decided to pour a final clear layer on top. And this is where the big problems begin. So there were lots of bubbles because I didn't seal the end grain of these squares enough. And I thought I could just torch them all out. But when you keep the torch on the resin for too long, it burns and destroys it and messes up the curing process, which is what you see happening here. Now, I didn't burn the whole thing, but the areas where I did burn it turned into this gel like consistency. And so here I am digging it out with a paint knife and trying to reverse the damages. And yes, this was very annoying and stressful because up until now, everything had gone so smooth. And now I've ruined that finish here where I'm almost at the end of the project. But I'm trying to save it here at the same time. So after scraping out tons of this burned epoxy and cleaning up those areas as good as I possibly could, I poured more clear epoxy over those areas so this thing can be perfectly level again, theoretically. And at this point, I'm not feeling too confident or sure on how this finish is going to end up. And I just want to say to the clear epoxy that this is why no one likes you and no one wants to work with you. Um, Now, this was actually my fault for not sealing the wood enough and trying to overcompensate with the torch. So I gave that 3 days to dry and came back to take this out of the mold. There were some bubbles, but not too many. And most of them were also at the surface, which means I can sand down past them and basically erase them. Removing this from the mold was very satisfying and it came off easily. And when I flipped it over, boom, there was this crazy yellow design that I didn't even realize that I had done.
That's crazy. Damn, son.
So when I was doing all that mixing and dragging, doing those motions on the surface and wondering what was happening to all of my yellow pigment, it was actually making a crazy design on the bottom. And this actually looked so good, it made me wonder
It's almost like I should use this side.
which side was better. So I asked my Instagram followers if they like it from the front or the back, and 75% of them said from the back. So I had to take this into consideration and give the audience what they want. But we'll get to that in a second. I sanded both sides with 40 and 80 grit just to get it somewhat flat. And after that, I pulled out my router and chamfer bit to shave off that sharp edge and put an 1/8 inch chamfer all the way around. It's a small detail that some people might say isn't necessary, but it makes the edges look so much cleaner. And I hear the ladies like it better this way as well. I flipped it over and did the same thing on the bottom side, which should maybe be the top, given that 75% of the survey says they like it better. Um, but I'm so attached to the side that I thought was going to be the surface that it's hard to let it go and accept that the side I couldn't even see might be better. So After cleaning up those chamfered edges and sanding this thing all the way up to 600 grit, I painted each of these black squares with the same black stain that I used in the lava table. And this was a very tedious process, but I felt it was necessary to keep this thing looking like somewhat of a volcano. And again, I'd like to thank the teachers who forced us to color in elementary school because it's a valuable skill set that really helped with this project and the other one. After staining these, I finished both sides with a rag and mineral oil. And wow, I was really pleased with how this finish turned out, especially given all the issues that I had earlier. Drop a comment and let me know which side you like best. I'm genuinely curious to hear what you guys think and see if that many people really think that the bottom side is the best side. Now, most people would have probably ended the project here, but my goal was to make this thing light up and add LEDs. So I'm sticking to the plan. I bought some plywood from Home Depot and started building a box for the lighting and the chessboard to fit inside of, which means that the board will have to be slightly elevated and leave enough room for the lighting underneath while being level with the top edge of the box. So I measured it to the desired height and added these shelf pins at the equal height all the way around those four corners. I've never done this before, and as simple as it seems, building things that are perfectly square is much harder than building something that's live edge.
Inch and a half. Dumb as hell.
But luckily, the chessboard was very square, so I just took some measurements, cut the pieces, and screwed it all together. I chose black spray paint because this thing is supposed to look somewhat volcanic. And I could have went much fancier with the box, but this is my first one and it's just a prototype. I lined the bottom of the box with LED strip lighting and made a hole in the bottom for the cord. I also added these little feet to the bottom, which gave that cord some room to stretch underneath. And now it's time to plug this thing in and see what it looks like. I must say, for the first time, this turned out really well. There's definitely room for improvement, and there's so much more that can be done with this concept. And I really want to make another one, but even better and a different color combination. Drop a comment, let me know what you think about this project. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.